I'm live. This is the January 25th regularly scheduled live stream for California convictions. Thank you to anybody who's watching this in reruns. I don't know if anybody's actually here right now, but I'm sure if I get to talking about my experiences in prison, well, somebody will tune in. Today, I intend to talk about my experiences in Badger Section at San Quentin. This was all the way back in 2001. You got to remember I spent a good chunk of time in prison, and I've been out for a little while on top of that. So I'm sure that what people experience whenever they go through reception in Northern California has changed quite a bit. That said, there are some universal experiences. Hi, Shaliste girl. There are some universal experiences about going through reception that I think I can talk about now. I've mentioned before the filth at San Quentin, and I don't think that I can overstate it. Not just in the areas that inmates could access, because really these places were scrubbed clean, even if they were dingy old concrete. Hey, Shelton, thank you. Even if they were dingy old concrete that you couldn't make look clean, they were sterile. People would get in there and scrub the walls and the floors with whatever chemicals they get their hands on. But this is a prison that's over 100 years old by and large, and there are parts of it that haven't been cleaned in that entire time. So you had the sides of the catwalks or along the razor wire where nobody was able to clean. There was a filth that had obviously been there for a long time. You'd see an honest-to-God decomposed rat corpse to the point that there was just nothing left, a little pile of bones over on the side. Badger Section, the specific section of San Quentin that I went through, was unique in that it was the maximum security reception. San Quentin had a lot of people come through it in a year, and most of them would go to one of the other sections. They had a section for just general inmates. I believe that was called Donner Section at the time. They had a section for inmates that had any kind of mental issues or might need to be evaluated for possible psychiatric commitment. And they had a section for inmates who were pending protective custody, who had some kinds of security or safety needs. The largest, of course, was the general custody inmate section. And that part of the prison overflowed into Badger Section or Alpine Section, the places where they had inmates for other reasons. If they didn't have room for you as just a general custody there to be processed inmate, then they'd send you to one of these other sections for a couple of weeks, and you wouldn't interact with the other inmates. You'd just be in a cell by yourself. But it was because the vast, vast majority of inmates going through San Quentin to be classified and eventually sent to another prison, they weren't maximum security inmates, they weren't psychiatric inmates or anything like that. They were just general custody inmates. What this meant was that the section that I was in, Badger Section, even though we didn't have that many inmates, I think we only had, 100 people out of the thousands housed in San Quentin and the more than 1,000 going through various reception activities. And that's because these guys were maximum security. I was on the list, and there were other people who I don't think that they thought they should be considered for maximum security. And there were other guys who were grateful they were there. They said things like, man, I figured I was just going to start in the SHU, but I guess they're going to let me start here in Badger Section, and then I'll go to a 180 yard, someplace maximum security, I'll get involved in stuff, and then I'll go to the SHU. It was the different personality type of inmate. You had your real hard convicts, guys that just knew they were going to pick up a stabbing and spend their time on a 180 yard. And they had other people who really hoped they could get their custody down like myself. I may have been there in the maximum security reception, but I figured if I could just maintain for a couple of weeks, a month or two, whatever it was, and not get into any trouble, I was a wobbler case. I didn't have to go to a 180 yard where everybody was strapped all the time. I could go to just a normal level 4, or even hopefully a level 3 yard where the custody wasn't so bad, the security wasn't so bad, and hopefully work my security level down instead of up. Because it's a reality of CDC that the higher your custody level is, meaning the more points you have, the more trouble you've gotten into, the more concerned the administration is that you're going to hurt somebody, your quality of life can actually be a lot better. The 180 cells are huge. If you're on a 180 yard, these are the high security yards, you have almost twice as much personal space as somebody in a cell on a 270 yard. If you want to order a package or a canteen on a 270 yard and you're on lockdown, no. When I was at High Desert, I went 6 months without getting canteen sometimes. 6 months without a package, 6 months without getting out of my cell, essentially. Whereas on the 180 yards, the high security, maximum security yards, they'll bring your canteen to your door. They'll bring your packages to your door, and you'll get yard no matter what. Even if it's just a tiny little concrete yard and it's you and your cellie, they let you go outside on a schedule always. This is because the 180 yards are so much more serious that the inmates who have things come and get it, as opposed to the lower security yards. The cops know they can get away with basically screwing you out of your program. I imagine that there's a literal conversation that goes on behind closed doors where they say, well, what are they going to do? If they were really going to stab somebody over this, they'd already be on the high security 180 yards. The only time that the high security, maximum security inmates are going to interact with the lower custody inmates is either if they behave for a while and their points drop, so they end up on a lower security yard until something goes wrong, or when they're going through reception, someplace like Badger Section, because there are a lot of lower security inmates there who are being evaluated for whether or not they need to be a maximum security inmate, like myself. If I had gotten involved in a little bit of trouble, heck, if I'd stabbed my co-defendant, which the shot caller was pushing for something like that to happen, well, you better believe that the administration then would have definitely known that I needed to be placed on a maximum security yard, Shadow Pit. And from there, I might have never worked my points down. Excuse me. I have to get a drink from my meh cup. That was a gift from my wife, that cup. I particularly like it. Thanks for pointing it out. Badger Section was really the only time whenever I was incarcerated that I was on a yard that was higher security than you would expect. High Desert, the 270 yard that I was on, I mean, it was a serious yard. I saw people get stabbed. I knew plenty of guys walking around strapped all day. But if the shot caller had announced, okay, everybody bring your piece out to yard, we're going to go kill all these guys from another race today, I don't know if it would have flown, even though we're supposed to all be serious hardcore convicts. I think there were a lot of guys on that 270 yard that I was on who just wanted to do their time. They would not have been happy about getting co-opted into a war of any type. This is why on prisons where there are multiple yards, and remember, prisons are divided. At High Desert, they had A, B, C, D yard. There's very little interaction, or at least direct interaction, between the inmates on one yard and another. You've got 1,000 inmates on B yard, and they don't interact with the inmates from C yard or D yard, except maybe like a kite that was sent very carefully through the mail. Or one guy knows that he can talk to his friend in medical and holler down the way so that he can get some information down. Go, hey, Frankie, tell D yard, whatever the thing is. It was actually the joke. If you wanted to go scare one of your friends, you'd walk up behind him, you'd get in his ear and tell him, hey, there's a message for you from C Yard. Just to get their attention. But short of this a little bit of communication back and forth, the yards operate independently. At High Desert, C and D yard were 180 yards. This means they are the maximum security. This is the strongest, toughest, scariest inmates you're going to find outside of the SHU, outside of environments where they don't leave their cell ever unless they're in handcuffs, and the only interaction they have each other is in little dog kennels, essentially, run cages they do yards in. The 270 yards are all guys who were on the 180 yards and behaved themselves for 3 whole years. That's the rule. You go 3 years without a shuable offense. You didn't stab anybody. You didn't get caught with drugs. You didn't punch a cop in the face. for 3 years, and then you can drop down to a 270. Or the 270 yard is also guys who were lower security. Maybe they were at fire camps or a level 2 yard or 3 yard and something happened. Maybe something big, they got in a lot of trouble, or maybe just something little, they got in a little bit of trouble, but it was enough that they worked their way up to a 270 yard. And if that's the case, then that's you end up with, I had an officer describe it to me as tidal problems, TIDAL, as in tide pools. You have hot water and cold water is what he said. You have the guys that are just trying to maintain and work their points back down. And you have the guys that are looking for trouble. They want to get their points up. They're tired of being on these low security yards with these wimpy inmates. They want to make it to the shoe back there, or back on the 180 yard. So, on the 270, you can end up with situations where you have some guy, let's say he's 50, and you don't know it whenever you walk onto the yard. Arthur D., I'm not sure if I missed you saying it, but did you ever go to the shoe, or did you also avoid this by not engaging in needless violence? I went to the hole or the shoe a half dozen times, all for stupid nonsense. The longest time that I spent in the hole was 3 months. And it was over a medical issue. I have sleep apnea, severe sleep apnea. And so I have to have a machine to assist my breathing whenever I sleep that plugs into the wall. They didn't have any place to house me on the yard I was on. There was no place that had a plug that was a direct current. So they sent me back to the hole for 3 whole months back there in the shoe, pending placement. A couple other little things like that. On an occasion, I slapped a guy on the arm to get out of trouble. I'm stuck in VA. How much to do an interview for my channel? The email is californiaconvictions@gmail.com. I don't expect I would charge you anything, but I definitely want to know what was going on with the channel and have some idea of what I was getting into. I'm just happy to be able to talk about my experiences and have people listen. I'm not looking to get rich off of this, I promise. The thing I was saying about 270 yards that I wanted to express is that you can end up with guys that are trying to work their points down, that come out of the shoe and the 180, honest to God, killers. And they just want to do their time because they've worked their way down to a softer, quieter yard. It's not the crazy 180. It's a little bit more relaxed. Call it prison light. But then you got other guys that are walking around with their chests puffed out. Youngsters trying to prove how tough they are, looking for a problem. And it did happen that guys would just assume that the old timer that they were dealing with wasn't a killer. And if you were lucky, whenever you're walking around with that kind of attitude, maybe somebody taps you on the shoulder and lets you know, hey man, don't you know who you're messing with? You might want to be real polite to that guy. Conversely, there are occasions. There was one time whenever I was at High Desert, the 2 guys got to flapping their mouths in the vent. And one guy, I guess he wasn't having it. They announced that the door was going to be the bell. And he heated up a hot pot full of baby oil. Boiling. Put it into a tumbler, stepped out of his cell, and I don't know what the other guy's plan was. Maybe he's going to run out, bink him in the face or something. Maybe even had a piece. I don't think he did. This is a secondhand story, but that hot pot full of baby oil, or that tumbler full of baby oil, melted that dude's face clean off. Because that's what happens whenever you assume that the guy that you're dealing with is going to bring the same level of violence to the table that you are. You announce, yeah, come on, let the door be the bell. You and I are going to get it on. And what he heard was, I'm going to murder you. You better murder me. You have to be really careful in CDC, and I suppose in life in general, because you don't always know who you're messing with. Gosh, my throat is... Pardon me. I went to the shoe, or the hole. I never made it back to the... They distinguish this kind of strangely. I was at High Desert, and there was a shoe that I went to, but I was not technically a shoe inmate, even though I was interacting with people in the shoe. Shoe just means secure housing unit, and you can be placed in the shoe for anything. You can have a safety concern. You can say, I think somebody's going to stab me. You got to get me out of here. Well, the secure housing unit is where they're going to place you, SHU, SHU. Pending an evaluation for what's going on, they just won't allow you to interact with the other inmates until they've decided that's where you belong. So it actually did happen on occasion that you might have one guy who was a rat and one guy who decided he was going to put holes in him, and they both end up back in the same building, yelling at each other down the tier, "Screw you, you piece of garbage, screw you back." But they're just not going to be allowed out of their cells back in the SHU. They're on separate program and nobody's walking around in the day room. The only time inmates interact with each other in these environments is at yard. And at yard, you're placed into handcuffs. They put your hands like this and then back around behind your back so that there's no reasonable way you could get out of them. You can't slip them under your feet. And then they walk you through the day room out into the back of the SHU to what look like dog kennels, essentially. It's big cages where it's just a cage next to a cage next to a cage next to a cage, 20 or 30 in a block, and then perhaps 3 or 4 blocks in for the SHU. If you're lucky and the cops are in a good mood, you can ask, "Hey, can I be in kennel number 6 and you put my friend in kennel number 7 so we can talk?" But unless he feels like putting his face right up against the wire mesh and letting you sock him in the side of the face, there is no way for somebody there to possibly hurt anybody else there. It's a very vanilla type of interaction. And this is where a lot of the gang business is conducted back there. You'll have whichever gang happens to have their yard that day, all at the corner of the SHU, talking to each other through the kennels about what's going to get done whenever somebody leaves the SHU, and takes a kite out to a yard. A yard, B yard, C yard, D yard, whatever yard they might be going to. This is why guys who want to work their way up in the gang, they want to get a name and be known. Well, the first step is a SHU term. I don't care how tough you are, what kind of program you run. If you're not known and you walk onto a yard, the guy who runs the yard is in charge. He tells you what to do. And if you want to stand up to him and go, "Heck with you, I'm in charge," well, he has the backing of the guys back in the SHU. He didn't control that he was put in charge of the yard. That's the gang members back in the SHU, whether it's the Aryan Brotherhood, the MA, the BGF, whatever gang happens to be running stuff. Goodness. Secure housing unit. Now, I feel like an idiot for thinking people were saying the SHU. I'm going to be honest, I thought the exact same thing whenever I started my term. Whenever I heard somebody say, "Go back to the SHU," I thought that it was just slang, like maybe the SHU is how you describe it because you get tied down real tight or something. I did not realize that SHU stood for Security Housing Unit. They also have a couple of other types of segregated housing, essentially. They have a PHU, Protective Housing Unit. There's only one of those in California, and it's in Corcoran, and that's where they send the high-profile victims, I guess is what we'll call them. Charles Manson was housed in the PHU. Philip Garrido, the piece of garbage that kidnapped J.C. Dugard, she's back in the PHU. But he is back in the PHU, pardon me. There's only about 100, maybe 200 inmates in California that are housed back in the PHU. And I did have occasion to talk to one guy. I had a bunkie who had been housed back in the PHU. He had informed on the Aryan Brotherhood, and for whatever reason, it was a big enough thing that they wanted him, that he was segregated all the way back into the PHU for a little while. And he described to me interacting on a daily basis with the high-profile, nasty people. Inmates tell stories. This guy was a friend of mine. His name was Gowan. And Gowan described interacting with Charles Manson. He claimed that he had helped Charles Manson smuggle out the audio tape of him singing a song. Once there was a dog who thought he was a frog, jumped in the river and drowned. And you can still find that audio tape of Charles Manson playing guitar and singing a little song that he'd written on some parts of the internet. Gowan swore that the reason that audio tape was out there at all was that he had bribed the recreational director to sneak out a bunch of cards and some audio tapes they'd recorded and give them to his wife, and that then they had been sold to a collector, and that he had managed to pay off his car and make a couple of house payments off of having that done. Yeah, whether it's true or not, who can say? Inmates love to tell stories, but he did have a write-up, and it was the most vague write-up I've ever seen. It said, you have been found guilty of business dealings and are being ejected from the SHU for business dealings. If you continue to conduct business dealings, further disciplinary action will be taken against you. No details, no supplemental paperwork. The entirety of the write-up that he was found guilty for was just an accusation he conducted business dealings, which is against the rules, as I discussed in a recent video. But generally, a 115 has a bunch of details, what you did, why they're upset with you, etc., etc. Gowan's claim was that the administration had wanted to keep a tight lid on everything, and that he had been informally told that he was just going to get kicked out of the PHU, he wasn't going to get in a bunch of trouble, and that they let it drop if he let it drop, because they were concerned about the negative publicity of having Charles Manson, of all people, smuggle some cards and some stuff like that in an audio tape out of an institution. I never did see Charles Manson because I was housed at New Corcoran, called SADF rather than Old Corcoran. They're very close together, but they are administrated entirely separately. It's different staff, different guards, and different inmates. I have a number of secondhand stories. I knew a bunch of guys who said that they'd met him or knew him. I knew a bunch of guards who had stories. One guard loved to tell the story of the time that he'd seen Charles Manson out on the yard, walking around barefoot. And he went over and went, "You, Manson, put your shoes on." And that Charlie had looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, "But I haven't been outside in 2 years." And that he told him, "I don't care, and I don't care if you ever go outside again, you put your shoes on when you're on the yard." I can't tell you if it's true or not. Guards like to tell stories same as the inmates do. But this was that guard's particular claim to fame, that he'd been out on the yard the first time Charlie came outside, and he was able to tell him to put his shoes on. I started by talking about San Quentin's Badger Section. And the point that I wanted to make was that it was such an interesting place to start my time, because there were some real killers there. There were guys who they had paroled from the SHU and went to the SHU whenever they came back, every time except this time. And this time they happened to be going through the maximum security reception to be evaluated to see if they needed to stay in as maximum security inmates. And there were other guys who, Chief Broom, I guess Chief Broom had committed a murder. And that was actually what we called him, because he was so reminiscent of the guy from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Quiet, kept to himself, didn't really seem like he knew what was going on, even though he's a big old dude. He was there being evaluated as a maximum security inmate, and I sure hope he didn't end up on a high security yard. I suppose he was a murderer. Maybe he's the most dangerous dude I met in my entire life, but he didn't seem all there. It really seemed like he was confused as to why he was even doing time, much less how to effectively do time. But the fact that he's a murderer, the fact that he needs to be evaluated for placement on a maximum security yard, means that he's also going to be there with Frankie. And Frankie's got 6 stabbings under his belt, and he's planning for the 7th. I know he's got a piece. If not on him at that moment, he can get it in 10 minutes, and he wants to use it. He's building his name. Earning his bones is the phrase. Means that whenever people look at you, they go, "Well, don't you know who that is? That's Frankie. Don't mess with Frankie. He'll kill you." You don't believe me? Well, just look at his paperwork. He killed 3 people last year. That's one way that guys do their time, and not many people do it this way, but some do. You earn that reputation so nobody will mess with you. And the last thing you want to be is the quiet, easygoing, relaxed guy there on the reception center that happens to piss off Frankie, because he's looking for that guy. He's looking for his next victim. And that's the way he's going to think of you. You're the victim. You're the guy that he put in the infirmary, or better yet, in the morgue, so that he's got a little bit more of a reputation on his jacket. He earned his bones, is what they say. Getting to San Quentin's Badger Section was it was a bit of a trial. I hadn't realized that processing into a prison was going to take, gosh, like 9 hours from the time that I showed up to the time that I actually made it to a cell. They do a lot of things. They do a quick medical evaluation. It's just like a 20-question thing, and most of it involves communicable diseases. They want to know if you have chickenpox or tuberculosis or some kind of STD. Actually, they ask a lot of questions about your genitals whenever you're processing into prison, believe it or not. In addition, they want to make sure that you're stable. You know, have you ever considered killing yourself? Are you hearing voices? Are you suffering from suicidal ideation? These are just those little initial questions that they have to ask. They want to take your weight. They're going to shave your head. This is back in 2001, whenever inmates had to shave their heads. You don't have to anymore, but they really made a thing whenever I arrived. You cut your hair down to this much or less, or we're writing you up. There was a number of very brave men who stood up for that. I believe the name of the guy who actually took it to court and won was Red Cloud. He was a Native American who refused to cut his hair. He refused to cut his hair for literal years, being written up every month, not getting canteen, not being allowed to leave his cell, any number of small pieces of harassment. And that's before he started the lawsuit. I guarantee you, once he started the lawsuit, he had cops actively harassing him. Oh, you want to change the way things are done? You want to wear your hair this way? You're different. Well, we'll show you. And I bet they did. But you know what? He showed them, because there's now a law in place that if you have a religious or a spiritual reason you need to wear your hair long, they don't break out those clippers. They don't tell you we're going to cut your hair and there's nothing you can do about it. Or if they do, you tell them, well, what about this law? What about Red Cloud? Didn't he take it to court? And they drop it because he showed them. God, I love that. I love the idea that one inmate with no power whatsoever was just stood up and said, no, this is not okay. My hair is part of my identity. It's part of my spiritual identity. And you punish me how you want, but you're wrong, and I'm going to endure that punishment, and I'm going to keep telling you you're wrong until somebody listens. And they did. Nowadays, whenever you go through reception, they don't break out them clippers. It's an option. Now, for me, they just told me, well, you're going to cut your hair or we will pin you down and cut your hair. There's a literal thing that the cop told me whenever I said I didn't want to have my hair cut. Well, I didn't argue past that. It didn't seem worth it to me, but thank God there's somebody who did take up that fight. Absolutely, 100% convict right there, right? Agree, 100%. One voice changes the world. Not always, but that's no reason to not raise your voice. There aren't a lot of things that I regret about my incarceration. I by and large, I did the things I wanted to. I got my degree. I made the place better whenever I could, and I avoided picking up more time or getting hurt. There are some things like that. I wish that I'd stood up a little more. I wish that I'd been a little braver in saying, this rule right here needs to be changed. Well, on the other hand, you never know how things would have played out. Maybe I wouldn't be talking about this right now if I had been just a little bit louder. I did always have a policy because I was good at legal work. I knew the rules. It's called the CCR, Title 15, and the Director's Operations Manual, the DOM. And then about this big of a book called the OPs, the Operational Procedures. And there are so many stupid, stinking rules. But if you take the time and you read them all and you learn them all, oh my goodness, there are so many stupid little rules that they're breaking in CDC. And I had a policy, and I'd tell anybody who would listen, if you don't like these rules, you tell me, I'll do what I can. And all I need from you is that you'll agree you won't just drop the 602. You won't just drop the lawsuit whenever they tell you, well, we wish you wouldn't complain about this thing. By and large, I'd help people write up their lawsuits and their 602s, and as soon as the cops applied some pressure, they'd drop it and give it up. But there were a couple of times that I got to help people try to change things at least. One regarded the day room bunks. They had a policy where CDC in the early 2000s was grossly overcrowded. I believe it was at 195% of capacity or something like that, meaning that it had been designed to hold X number of inmates, and it had just short of twice that many inmates in a given prison, in a given yard. So they started just looking for any place to put bunks. One thing that they did was place bunks out in the day room, and I was housed in these day room bunks. A lot of guys who went through CDC in this time period had this experience. There were a lot of small rules that were just being actively broken, and whenever people brought up the fact that it was, and I mean legally, cruel and inhumane living conditions, as in the court had already laid down that the X things must be provided for inmates in order for it to not be considered cruel and inhumane. We brought it up again and again, and eventually they did shut the day room bunks down. The prison law office had a large lawsuit that eventually resulted, and it took a decade probably, in these things getting shut down. One that I was instrumental in helping was the lights that were above the day room bunks. They left them on all the time. It was never dark. I helped somebody put together a pretty decent 602 regarding the fact that this has been shown to have adverse psychological impact on people. If you just keep them in a bright room 24 hours a day, they don't sleep properly, they don't dream properly, and it results in violence, essentially, if you put a bunch of violent people and house them like this. They did, as part of the lawsuit that the PLO brought, this was one of the things that was raised, and I was always hopeful that my 602 that went to Sacramento had been seen by the prison law office and had been used as part of the ammunition to get these day room bunks shut down. Speaking for myself, it was, 6 months or something like that, where it was never dark, not one time. The closest that it came to dark was probably as light as you'd see outside around sunset, that duskish level of brightness. And I can understand from a security perspective why the administration didn't let it be any darker than that. But it definitely impacted my sleep, my mental health, I'm sure, and everybody else who was housed there. Howdy channel, glad to see you're back up and running. Pleasant Tuesday surprise. Quality is great, by the way. I am glad to hear it. I think I have everything set up properly. I actually had a pretty panicky moment just about 10 minutes before the live stream started. It's called the Elgato Cam Link, whatever it is, a piece of the setup to keep my camera hooked up to my computer. Oh, it broke. And I was frantically trying to figure out some way to get it all hooked up so that I was able to continue my live stream. All's well that ends well, because it appears to be working great, but we'll see how it looks next week. Let me see if I have any comments that I want to respond to. New World Order. I take a stand against chomos. I try not to really soapbox on this one, but if you want my one thing that I have no negotiation for, you did it, and that is what you are for the rest of your life, it's definitely sexually abusing a child. It is the most abhorrent and evil thing that a man or a woman or a child can do. I know that taking a life is equivalent. It's you ruin a life either way, but it's the thing that stands out to me. I can comprehend somebody getting so angry that they murder somebody or just not seeing another way out. I'm not saying it's right. It's an evil and awful thing to do. It's comprehensible to me. Sexually abusing children is the lowest of the low, and there is no degree of nastiness that I saw imputed on these people while I was incarcerated that I didn't think they deserved much, much worse. I happen to have spent a good chunk of my time on, they're called SNY yards, sensitive needs yards. And that's where they send the child molesters. It's where they send the rats. That's what I was. I ratted on some people. It's where they send the prison thieves, the guys who just can't get along with some other people. It was unfortunate. I know that the Hollywood perception is that if you go to prison for something nasty like that, you're getting beat up every day by the guards and then every other day by the inmates. It's not true. The places I was, at least, I can tell you, these guys pretty much just did their time, and rigs like me held them in contempt, had no love for them. Don't get out of my way, you piece of garbage. But nobody wants to be the guy who walks up on one of these dudes and dings him in the side of the head for no good reason. You're going to get punished too. It's a matter of how much you're willing to suffer for how angry you are, I suppose. And I don't mean to suggest that I am a proponent of vigilante justice, that people should just run around finding nasty guys like that and hurting them. At the same time, I promise that whenever something nasty did happen to one of these dudes, I was not crying for them and sympathizing for them. I had an acquaintance. Is Big Ben. Big Ben had a reputation for being somebody who'd slap a chomo. I saw him do it 3 times before he got his indeterminate shoe term, and I never heard from him after that. It was 3 times in about the year that I knew him, one of these guys who was openly known as a piece of garbage. Some of them get kind of uppity. They start mouthing off because they know that you're not going to do anything. They know that it's an environment where they are protected. I absolutely heard guys bragging about their nastiness. We knew one dude on the yard named Coach. He got the name Coach because he said he'd molested a baseball team's worth of children. It's awful. Ben had a reputation for if you got in his way, if you mouthed off to him, if he heard you talking about this kind of garbage, he was just fine with walking up. And he's a big dude. He could have killed somebody if he wanted. He could have beaten somebody to death. But 3 times, he walked up, grabbed a dude's side of the head, and bink, slapped him 1 time. All 3 times, he picked up shoe terms, but I'll tell you that Ben wanted anything from me. He had it coming. I don't think he liked me that much. We weren't friends. He was a reg. He'd been in the gangs. He was one of the cool kids in prison, is I suppose the way you'd express it. I was not. Kept to myself, did clerical stuff, but I shook his hand on one occasion and told him, man, I respect the hell out of you, and if you ever need something, you let me know. I would have liked to help him on his appeals, but I never got a chance to do it. Well, but I checked the comments for a second, see if we have anything interesting. Let's see here. Cons out here desperately need help. Howdy channel. How can I legally help people with filing in court? New World Order. That's a tough question. I'm not 100% sure offhand, but I do intend to, sometime in the near future, do a video on a couple of legal cases that I've tried to keep my eye on. I did a video about the case of Shane Goldsby, the guy who beat to death the elderly man Munger, piece of garbage, who had molested Shane's sister and bragged about it to him. They got celled up together. And Shane Goldsby went, oh, I know you. You were my mom's boyfriend or uncle or whatever the heck this guy's relationship was. How are you doing? And Munger started hemming and hawing about, I'm innocent. I didn't do it. They hadn't told Shane. Shane didn't know that his sister had been molested by this guy. And then whenever he found out, he snapped. First, he went to the cops, told them, I can't be in with this dude. They ignored him. Well, he went back, binked that guy in the head a couple of times, stomped on his head when he was on the ground, killed him. The guy's name is Shane Goldsby. He's doing time right now. Anybody can Google him. Anybody can write him anything for him. He got 24 years for that. The guy was 70 years old and was a serial pedophile. Had bragged to Shane about molesting his sister. At least according to Shane, the guy wouldn't shut up about it. Kept giving him details until Shane decided to kill him, or at least to attack him, and the guy died. I'm not arguing. Again, vigilante justice is not the solution. The solution is not, let's all go out and kill all of them. Please don't hear that. But the court acknowledged no mitigation. It was the same as any other premeditated murder. There is no mitigating factor in finding out that somebody is that level of a piece of garbage. And I consider it like a battered women syndrome defense. If you find out that somebody you love has been hurt in that manner, yes, everybody's first thought is, oh my God, somebody needs to kill that man. It's not the right thought. It's not the solution. But the fact that that's where this guy went is not the same as somebody who sees the guy has a nice TV, busts into his house and kills him to take it. These are different crimes. Another gentleman, and I don't remember his name offhand, but I will post it in the comments of this video. If anybody happens to know the case, they can comment on it. Found out that his daughter had been sold. Literally, his daughter's boyfriend took her out of state, underage, and sold her. She escaped. This guy found out what had happened, took this dude out in the woods and killed him. again, there was no mitigation acknowledged by the court. He was charged with first-degree murder. I believe his case is still pending, but he's likely to end up spending the rest of his life in prison over it. I don't know what else to say except that I feel that there should be a set of laws in place acknowledging that whenever you find out that somebody is that degree of a piece of garbage, that they do this type of thing and have done it in their lives, it is a mitigating factor. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and read some comments. I perhaps got a little bit upset about the Shane Goldsby case. That really struck home with me. The New World Order, you ratted on someone. I absolutely did rat on somebody. It was, I'll put a link to the video in the description. And it is what it is. They were planning on killing a couple of guys on my yard. I raised my hand first. I said, hey, this ain't right. Something else should be done. And they decided they were going to do it anyway. And, well, I know how the system works. I couldn't raise my hand a second time, say, hey, guys, please listen to me. It's not right. But I also was unwilling to live the rest of my life with it on my conscience that these dudes had been murdered for just nothing. And I did. I put in a little kite. I told the administration what was going on. And I ended up doing the rest of my term SNY for it. Hell, that could come back to bite me one of these days. I'm sure that the guys that I ratted on still resent it, but it is what it is, and I was not going to stand by and do nothing. I do not regret that choice. Ugh. The New World Order scares me, I ain't gonna lie. Well, if nothing else, I don't know that everything has to be in caps, and I'm not criticizing, you do you, but the Shane Goldsby case really needs to have more press coverage. Horrible case. You are absolutely correct, and I couldn't believe that it didn't get more coverage. I went on every other prison channel, and I sent them emails. I commented in their live streams, please do a video about this. A couple of them did, and a couple of them did independent of me. Jay Williams, Let's Live Life. The video he did, which was great, had nothing to do with my reaching out to him. He'd done the video before I even heard about the case. A couple of other guys, not 30 to Life, Streets Ain't Loyal. He did a video on it, and I sure did appreciate him doing it because he 100% did it just because he heard how nasty the case was and wanted to comment on it. Lockdown, watching since day one. I appreciate that, man. I appreciate... Yeah, thank you for listening. That's what I say. And I don't mean it to be half-hearted. I mean it sincerely. I can't believe that the things that I say, anybody wants to hear. Thank you for listening. Did you ever eat Michael Thompson in prison? Are you following his current case? I don't think so. I'll go ahead and Google that whenever I get out. Michael Thompson. Additionally, Mitch Smiley and OG Badger. No, I never met either of those dudes. But Mitch Smiley has done videos on Snow Rock, the White Crip, and I do remember hearing about him whenever I was locked up. That was one of those things that the whites really were involved in, is if there was a white guy who was a member of another gang, he didn't roll with the whites. Oh, it was always a disaster. I don't have an opinion about the prison politics. I don't care what gang wants to win against what gang. But whenever somebody would roll up on the yard and he was obviously white, except, you know, he ran with whatever other gang, you immediately knew that it was going to be a whole thing and that you just hoped it wasn't going to end in a riot. I've been listening since May 2021. Don't know when the channel actually started. I think I started it all the way in December. So about 5 months before that, actually. But if we're being honest, my first 20 or 30 videos may not have had the highest quality. I was getting my legs out, finding my voice. Arthur D comments, criminals, of course, are very fearful of having their crimes revealed. But to me, true ratting is only when one reports on co-conspirators of a crime they also committed. And there's some validity there. I don't know exactly where what I did falls on the rat scale. I was a member of the gang. I found out the gang was going to be doing something, and I went and told the cops about it. So as far as that goes, there's no question that's ratting. That said, I certainly didn't get any consideration for it. It's not like I was looking at charges and they dropped them because I told on people, or they'd put the piece in my hand and I went and told the cops, hey, I don't want to stab somebody. You guys got to do something. I 100% stuck my nose in business it didn't belong in, and I made my life a lot worse for doing it. That decade of time that I ended up doing S&Y after it, I promise that every stinking day I thought, man, was this worth it? I don't regret it. I think it was the right choice, and I'm confident that I'd be seeing those dudes' faces in my sleep if I hadn't raised my voice, but it is what it is. Ugh. Well, I'm not going to just keep... Who was the finest CO that got pulled by the inmates in High Desert? That's a tough question, actually. I do remember one female officer who was legitimately gorgeous. I remember commenting to my cellie at one point, "Holy cow!" And him commenting back, "Yeah, keep your eyes in your head. She has a reputation for if, she catches guys leering at her, really making their lives bad." And I don't mean within the rules like writing you up. I mean telling one of her friends that they take you in a back room and beat you half to death. And it came out that she absolutely had an inmate on the side that she was giving lighters and cigarettes and little things like that to. It didn't come out whether or not he was actually having sex with her, but it seems like a reasonable assumption given the rest of the circumstances. I can tell you who the most god-awful CO, the ugliest, and I hate to judge by looks, but she was not a pleasant woman, just hygiene if nothing else. She smelt. Who she had a reputation for sexually harassing inmates. And I didn't want to work back in the kitchen where she was because she was known for having set guys up. And whenever I got a transfer out of the kitchen, and the lieutenant on the yard specifically put in the paperwork to get me transferred because I told him I wanted to be his clerk, I'd do good work on the paperwork, just get me out of that kitchen. She came to the office and she told him that she was going to appeal it. She was going to have me put back in the kitchen. And then she put me on the out count so that I had to go to the kitchen the next day, and told me to come into the back of the kitchen and talk to her. And I refused to. I refused the direct order, said, "No, ma'am, I'm going to stay right here with all these witnesses." And she got right up in my face and she whispered in my ear, "I'm going to get you back in this kitchen and I'm going to get you." It didn't happen. Nothing more came of it from there. But it speaks to the type of situation that an inmate can end up in if they're involved in a sexual relationship with a guard. It's a scary position to be in because for as long as things are great, they're great, but it is a one-sided power dynamic. If you do the wrong thing, if you say the wrong thing, if whatever happens so that they're done with you, well, the guard starts doing the math. He has dirt on me. He knows things. I just can't let it end. I'm going to have to do something to make sure that it ends clean. I don't doubt that there are a lot of guys who have engaged in relationships with guards and then back in the shoe a couple of months later really regretting their choice. I knew one guy, and I don't remember his name offhand, but we were well acquainted. I talked to him a bunch of times, and I actually met his wife out in the visiting room and got to talk to her for just a minute. "Hi, ma'am." She had been a correctional officer, and they had been housed at another institution. He was an inmate, and she was a guard. And she did things above the board, where they maybe started some kind of relationship, they were making out, whatever it was, and she realized the mistake she was making. And she went to the warden and put in paperwork and requested a transfer. And then once she transferred to another institution and they transferred him to another institution, then she put in the paperwork and started visiting him, and they eventually got fully married, and I'd assume lived a long, happy life married. He had an interesting story where he said that after she'd put in the paperwork saying she wanted to transfer because she was attracted to such and such inmate and intended to pursue a relationship with him, he said that that very day they put him in handcuffs, and they moved him to an isolated part of the prison, and they took him to an interview room that he'd never even seen this part of the prison. And they handcuffed him into a little chair after strip searching him and all that, and the warden sat down across from him. And the warden chuckled. This is his story. Warden said, "I can't believe this, but I don't know what's going on in my institution. For all I know, you have a handgun in your cell, and I have 3 other guards that are involved in some kind of conspiracy, because my officer is admitting that you and she are conducting some kind of relationship. And that means that you are leaving this institution, and I'm going to be tearing apart this yard because the fact that she came to me instead of being caught means that this is planned, means that you guys decided this was the moment where she was going to come clean. And I don't know what other part of your plan might be going on right now. He said that from the moment that the guards came in and said, inmate, whatever his name was, cuff up, he didn't speak to one other inmate. There wasn't a time that he was even in the same area of the prison as the other guys. He was in an isolated cell, that he was being fed separately. He couldn't have yelled down the tier, hey, does anybody know Frank on a yard? That he was completely incommunicado until the transport officer came and put him on his own special bus to get moved to another prison. It makes sense that they would have brought that level of security to the table, but wow, what an incredible situation to have been involved in. Whenever I originally talked to him and he'd said that, not only did I pull an officer, but I'm married to one, I'd been skeptical, but it was a well-known thing. A lot of guys knew him. I did meet his wife out in the visiting room briefly. And I do hope that things ended up great for them because they seemed like a nice couple. They'd been together for at least, I think, 3 or 4 years whenever I met him. And the fact that she damaged her career to that degree, she was still a correctional officer, but I'm sure that she ended up doing something like sorting mail or doing some prison duty that didn't involve being around inmates. Really hurt her career and probably cost her a lot of money in the long term. Was there anybody famous on the special needs yard that I was on? Probably, but famous by prison standards and famous by real world standards are probably a little different. I was at SADF E-Yard. Phil Spector, the millionaire music producer, was housed with me. I ate meals with him regularly, and I've talked about him quite a bit. Robert Downey Jr. was not on the yard that I was on, but he was at the prison I was at. He was housed on F Yard, and he had paroled from the prison just a little while before I got there. People talked about him regularly. F Yard at SADF was a pilot yard, a special rehab program yard, essentially. The quality of life for the inmates there was very high. It was nice, carpeted dormitories with only 4 inmates and a nice big dorm where the door was open all the time. The food was better. It was known that F Yard was the place that if you could get sent there, they were going to treat you really good. So it's not surprising that's where Robert Downey Jr., and of course he's famous for Iron Man and some other roles like that, he did his time. There were some, I don't know about famous, but certainly infamous guys on the yard that I was on too. I've described the serial killer, Roy Norris, who I read about him in the book Mindhunter, which was an autobiography written by one of the first FBI criminal profilers. And he described some of the cases that he had been involved in. And as I was reading this book, Mindhunter, I realized Roy Norris. Where do I know that name? I know that stinking... And I looked over at Poochie. Roy Norris. And whatever Miley. There was Miley too. Richard Miley, Michael Miley, whatever Miley's name was. They were both mentioned in this book. And I told Poochie, these 2 guys right here, man... They're on this yard. I know these guys. That was, well, I was going to say exciting, but that's not the right word given the sheer nastiness these 2 guys were in for. There was a gentleman named the Raider Raper who had apparently raped a cheerleader for the Raiders. This guy got beat up pretty regularly. He was one of the few inmates who were involved, had some kind of nastiness on their case, who I saw really get singled out by other inmates as well. That piece of garbage right there needs to get beaten up. Strangely, it was because of the football team aspect. If you were a Raider fan and you wanted to demonstrate your loyalty for the team, you go beat this guy up. And it did happen in the time that I was there that somebody liked the Raiders and found out this guy had raped a cheerleader for the Raiders and went over and banged him in the side of the dome. Did the serial killers Miley and Norris know each other? No, they did not, and they were very different types of monsters. Norris I'd eaten meals with. I'd talked to. He lived a couple of cells down from me, and I never would have described him as a friend because he had perhaps a strange vibe. But you have to sit down at a table with somebody, and I never worried about sitting down at a table with him until it clicked what he was in for. And of course, after that, I really just didn't want, oh my goodness. But he could blend in quite well. He was the Bundy type of predator, where I imagine one of the ways that he managed to find his prey was appearing to be kind and friendly and normal. Miley was not. Miley was obviously wrong in the head. He was a true monster, and he couldn't hide it. I recall reading the transcripts from his case whenever I was doing a video on him, and some of the things he said about the murders of young boys that he committed made very clear that this guy, he couldn't hide his monstrousness. I was going to quote some of the nasty stuff he said, but I don't want to repeat it. It's just so... I think that I'm going to start wrapping up this live stream. I want to go up real quick and make sure that I didn't miss any questions or comments. And if anybody had any follow-up questions or they had a last subject they wanted me to address before I started wrapping up, well, I don't mind doing it. Let's see here. Aaron Anderson says I need a trim up. You know, I'm thinking about it. I'm not for sure yet. I'm liking growing the beard, but man, it itches. YouTube name change, but I used to be active in the comments, especially when I started the live streams. Well, that's all right, and I'm pretty happy to have anybody that wants to be active in the comments. It's pretty cool to have people to interact with. 14 watching, 9 likes. Well, grateful for all the likes, grateful for all the watches and comments, and it's all right. I'm perfectly happy to... Don't worry about smashing that like button or subscribing. Y'all do whatever you want to do. I'm gonna keep talking either way. It's not a big deal. Stumbled across the channel out of curiosity of the kosher meal plans, but was taken by your storytelling. Downloaded all my vids for my plane ride from San Fran and made a pit stop outside San Quentin. I've actually got a friend doing time in San Quentin right now, and I'm hopeful he's going to write me about the conditions there because I'm curious to see how things are progressing. I bet it's still just a nasty hole. They keep talking about shutting it down. Considering the value of the real estate of San Quentin, and similarly the prison Chino in Southern California, I'm always baffled they don't shut them down and just sell the land. Because the land has to be worth more than it would cost to just build a new prison somewhere else. An island in San Francisco, for God's sakes, Alcatraz? I don't know what it is that they plan to do with it long term outside of a historical landmark. But the value of the real estate certainly makes it seem that it shouldn't ever be used to house inmates again. And I feel the same way about San Quentin and Chino. Whenever they were built, it made sense to have prisons there, but at this point, it's such an urban area that just the security risk of having a prison with dangerous inmates in the middle of a city, it seems like that should be more important than whatever the value of having those inmates housed are. My hair looks cool today, kind of like that picture with my wife and newborn. Thank you. Yeah, cool. And shout out to Danny Powell. You got it down, Dan Powell. It's a shout out for you. Thanks for listening, man. And I appreciate my intelligent and articulate conversation. Cool. All right, guys. Again, thank you everybody for listening. I'm going to keep dropping videos this week. I hope to talk about the professor and the ongoing saga with Phil Spector's freezers in the next couple of videos, and I will absolutely be back on Tuesday doing another live stream. Thank you for listening.